Marie Antoinette's last words weren't about cake. They were a polite apology to her executioner. The obsession with a dying man's breath isn't about the words themselves, but the terrifying power of a period at the end of a sentence that cannot be edited. We treat these final utterances as the ultimate distillation of a soul, assuming that when the shadow of the grave looms, the mask of the persona must finally slip to reveal the raw truth beneath. Yet, the reality is far more calculated. The most legendary last words in history were rarely spontaneous cries of the heart, but rather the final, deliberate tactical maneuvers of men and women who realized that while they could no longer control their lives, they could still seize control of their legacy. Every syllable uttered in those final seconds was a gamble played against eternity, a way to ensure that the narrative of a lifetime wasn't written by the victors, but by the person taking their final breath. If you believe that the dying have no reason to lie, you have misunderstood the weight of the historical record and the vanity of the human ego. Stay until the end, and you will see how a single, possibly misheard word from a dying king in Babylon didn't just end an era. It dismantled the largest empire the world had ever seen, proving that the most dangerous thing a human can do is speak while they're leaving. The true cause of these legendary echoes isn't found in a sudden burst of wisdom, but in a legal loophole that turned a gruesome execution into a silent act of financial warfare. In the autumn of 1692, Giles Corey stood in a field in Salem, Massachusetts, not as a victim of witchcraft, but as a man who understood that the only way to save his sons from poverty was to die without ever entering a plea. If he spoke the words, guilty, or not guilty, the law would seize his sprawling farm and leave his family destitute. If he remained silent, the law was forced to press the truth out of him using a medieval torture known as peine forte et dure. The sheriff piled heavy, jagged fieldstones onto a wooden board resting on Corey's chest, the weight slowly collapsing his ribcage and forcing the air from his lungs in ragged, whistling gasps. Spectators watched in a sickening silence as the old man's eyes began to bulge, expecting him to finally scream out a plea to end the agony, but Corey was playing a much longer game than the court realized. He knew that every second he remained silent was a second that protected his land, turning his physical destruction into a legal fortress that the witch hunters could not breach. The twist that nobody in that Salem field saw coming was that Corey wasn't just enduring the pain, he was actively provoking his executioners to finish the job before his resolve could break. When the sheriff asked one final time for a plea, Corey didn't beg for mercy or even scream in pain. He looked the man in the eye and demanded more weight. It was a command that turned a victim into a master, ensuring that he died an unconvicted man and that his sons inherited every acre of the soil he was currently being crushed into. This same professional coldness appeared centuries later on May 9, 1864, when Major General John Sedgwick stood atop a parapet at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, ignoring the frantic warnings of his men as Confederate sharpshooters began to find their range. Sedgwick wasn't being reckless. He was attempting to manage the collective terror of his troops by projecting an image of absolute, bulletproof invincibility during a moment of tactical collapse. He watched his soldiers ducking for cover and felt a surge of professional disdain, believing that the psychological cost of cowardice was far more dangerous than any lead ball fired from 1,000 yards away. He turned to his men with a smirk, his voice carrying over the whistle of incoming fire, and uttered the most famous ironic sentence in military history: "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." The irony wasn't just in the timing, but in the fact that the bullet struck him beneath the left eye just as he finished the sentence, a mathematical impossibility that seemed to mock his very existence. His staff officers watched in horror as the man who had just promised them safety collapsed into the mud, his blood staining the very earth he was supposed to defend. We remember the quote as a joke about arrogance, but for the men standing in that trench, it was the sound of their last shred of hope being snuffed out by a sniper's precision. The consequence of Sedgwick's final words was a total paralysis of the Union command for hours, as the invincible leader's sudden absence left a vacuum that nearly cost them the entire engagement. Why do we celebrate the confidence of a man who was proven so catastrophically wrong within the span of a single heartbeat? Perhaps it is because we prefer the drama of a perfect irony over the messy, silent reality of a soldier who simply dies without saying anything at all. The scene shifts from the muddy trenches of Virginia to the opulent, crumbling decadence of Rome in 68 AD, where Emperor Nero found himself hiding in a dingy suburban villa, listening to the hoofbeats of the soldiers set to drag him back to the city for a public execution. Nero didn't view his impending death as a political failure or a moral reckoning, but as the tragic closing night of a grand theatrical performance that the world was too small-minded to appreciate. As he fumbled with a dagger, unable to bring himself to strike, he didn't lament his lost empire or the people he had murdered. He wept for the loss of his own talent. His final cry, "Qualis artifex pareo," "When an artist dies in me," reveals the terrifying depth of a narcissism that could view the collapse of a dynasty as nothing more than a ruined stage play. This same obsession with the final image drove Pancho Villa, the Mexican revolutionary, to attempt a rewrite of his own ending while his body was being riddled with 9 soft-point bullets in 1923. Villa was driving his Dodge sedan through the streets of Parral when the assassins opened fire, and as he slumped over the steering wheel, he realized with a jolt of horror that he hadn't prepared a legendary exit. He grabbed his friend and gasped, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." The twist is that the legendary last words attributed to Villa in many history books, "I only ask that you say I died like a man," were a complete fabrication, a lie designed to cover up the fact that his actual final thought was a panic about his own branding. This reveals a hidden mechanism of history. We are so uncomfortable with the idea of a great person dying a mundane or messy death that we will collaborate with them to invent a better story. We see this in the death of the great landscape painter J.M.W. Turner in 1851, who allegedly looked at the window on his deathbed and declared, "The sun is God." It is a perfect, poetic summation of a life spent chasing light, but witnesses at the time suggested he was actually just complaining about the draft from the window or struggling to breathe. We choose the "sun is God" version because it gives us the closure we crave, a neat bow tied around a complex and difficult human life. The danger of this curation is that it masks the true, jagged nature of the end, replacing the human experience with a polished marble statue that no longer breathes. Nowhere was this curation more world-shattering than in the sweltering heat of Babylon in June 323 BC. As Alexander the Great lay paralyzed by a mysterious fever while his generals circled his bed like vultures. They didn't want to know if he was in pain or if he had any final wishes for his family. They wanted the name of the man who would inherit the known world. Alexander was only 32, and he had built an empire that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas, yet he had failed to do the one thing a king must do: provide a clear succession. As he struggled to speak, his generals leaned in so close they could smell the wine and death on his breath, desperate for a single name that would prevent a civil war. He supposedly whispered one word, "Kritisto," meaning, "to the strongest." It was the ultimate poison pill of last words, a final decision that ensured his empire would not be preserved, but torn apart by the very men standing in that room. But there is a lingering theory that Alexander didn't say "Kritisto" at all, but rather "Kriteros," a disputed interpretation, the name of his most loyal general who happened to be away in Macedonia at the time. If the generals misheard him, either by accident or by a calculated, collective choice, then the following 40 years of bloody warfare and the total disintegration of his empire were caused by a single, misinterpreted syllable. Did Alexander intend to burn the world down as he left it, or did the world simply hear what it wanted to hear so it could justify the chaos that followed? The hidden truth behind every legendary last word is that they are rarely for the dying, but for the living who are left behind to carry the burden of the story. We demand these grand statements because they provide a sense of narrative justice, a belief that a human life is a book that must have a satisfying final sentence rather than a random, mid-thought interruption. When we repeat Marie Antoinette's apology or Sedgwick's boast, we are participating in a grand act of myth-making that prefers a beautiful lie over the cold, silent reality of biological failure. The most profound, last words, are often the ones that were never spoken, the silence of men like Giles Corey who realized that the most powerful thing you can say at the end is nothing at all. By refusing to speak, he forced history to remember his actions instead of his adjectives, a rare feat in a world obsessed with the sound of its own voice. We are haunted by these quotes because they represent the one thing we can never truly have: the last word in a conversation with fate. This leads to a chilling consequence. If we spend our entire lives preparing for a final, legendary sentence, we risk missing the reality of the life we are actually living. The performance of death becomes more important than the integrity of the journey, turning our final moments into a PR campaign for a ghost. If the most famous last words in history were actually misheard, fabricated, or calculated lies, what does that say about the truths we build our civilizations upon?